and ethics. Okay, in 2021, she was awarded an OBE for services to social justice, but you might recognise her from her time as CEO of Quartet Community Foundation from 2015 to 2020. So Sue, thank you so much for joining us today. I know I'm not alone by putting my hand up and saying that I find all of this a little bit overwhelming. I know that Sue is going to reassure us and tell us what we need to keep an eye out for. Over to you, Sue.
Great, thank you so much, Sophie and committee and the whole fundraising group for having me along today. Really appreciate it. I'd like to start by asking you to imagine that it's 2029, 5 years from now, and inspired by you, people in your charity are confidently using data and AI-powered technology to carry out tasks and reveal hidden insights. Things like your donor communications, your events, your interaction with beneficiaries, your back office functions like finance and HR, they all cost less and they achieve more than you could ever have done in 2024. And you, well, you're valued like never before because you're at the forefront of using technology and data to boost your charity's fundraising and to benefit the communities you're here to serve. Now, you may be sitting there thinking, oh, that sounds like an overly rosy future, but I do believe we can all get there with some effort. And the route to that future is artificial intelligence. So there's three things that we all got to grasp hold of if we want to think about artificial intelligence and how we can use it to get to that rosy future. First of all is understanding what artificial intelligence actually is. Secondly is understanding what the opportunities are to use it. And thirdly is knowing what the threats are that using AI can bring. So that's what we're going to talk about for the next 40 minutes or so. And I'm going to weigh up the pros and cons and see if on balance we think that AI is a benefit or a burden to people like you. Now, you may have seen a recent report that found that 73% of charity leaders don't feel prepared to respond to the opportunities and the challenges that AI brings. And 48% of charity leaders said they're worried about the consequences of AI. And I think these are really common features that I see whether I'm talking to businesses or people in the third sector. I also know from my own time spent in not-for-profits, as Sophie mentioned, I used to be with Quartet Community Foundation, that we cannot afford to take up every new technology that comes along. So in the charity world, I know everybody's asking themselves, well, how much effort should we be putting in to raising our skills and buying in new technology so we can harness the power of AI? Is it really worth it, frankly, when you've got so much else on your plate? So I hope we're going to answer those questions today. Now, my background is I spent 50% of my career working with very dynamic, very entrepreneurial businesses, helping them operate with more purpose, and 50% of my career working with not-for-profits. And then we've been leveraging tools from the entrepreneurial world without ever losing sight of values. But constant frustration through my career, whether that's as a chair, non-executive director, chief executive, and so on, my frustration has always been that data is generated in silos in organizations, and then it's kept in those silos. And as a leader, you just think, oh, if only we could read across that data, if we could link things together, we'd be able to find insights that would really help us take the organisation forward. And an example of that is when I was at Quartet Community Foundation, we were giving out millions of pounds every year in grants and getting wonderful feedback reports coming back into the organisation. And some of that was relatively straightforward to analyse because it was in people had chosen from drop-down boxes or given numerical answers, from 1 to 10. So you could analyse that in a fairly straightforward way. But lots of the information we got was in the form of unstructured text, the stories, basically, that people would tell us about the difference that our grant had made. And you had a feeling that if only we could really analyse that text and find the common threads in it, it would be amazing to help us write a really good impact report every year. Well, we had a volunteer who came into the office for a couple of years and wrapped a wet towel around her head and tried to analyse this data, this unstructured text, to find those insights for an impact report. But it was a really, really tough job for a human brain to do. And so we also asked Bristol University, we said to them, hey, we've heard about natural language processing, one type of artificial intelligence that is brilliant at doing exactly this, finding the patterns in unstructured text. And plug our data into your machine, please, and work your magic. And of course, the university said, we don't really know how to do that, sorry. And long story short, nobody knew how to do it. So it was a deep frustration to me that in theory, things were possible, in practice, we just couldn't do them. Now, in 2019, I'd heard that the government backed the creation of new master's degrees, MScs in AI and data science, because they'd recognised that the data science, the AI world was very, very monotone, and they wanted to have more diverse people coming into the sector. So these MScs are conversion courses specifically aimed at bringing anybody from any background, not maths, not computer science, into the AI and data science world. And I joined the first cohort of people in September 2020 taking up these new degrees. At the same time, I set up the company AI Governance because I recognised, fun though it is to sit around coding all day, that's not actually what makes me want to leap out of bed in the morning. So the mission of AI Governance is to inspire as many people as possible to use AI with wisdom and integrity. Using it is one level of difficulty. Using it with wisdom and integrity is a whole other ballgame. And we do things like leadership education, board development sessions, business consultancies, right from the basics of what AI is through to helping organisations develop specific use cases and then creating really strong AI and data governance. So I've got some slides, and Sophie's already put them in the chat for you. I'm not going to bombard you by screen sharing all of them, but I am going to start with a few. So we'll start with covering what AI actually is. There we go. Hopefully that's coming onto your screens now. So the concept of artificial intelligence actually isn't that new. It's been around since the 1950s. And despite the fact it's been around that while, there's never been a single definition that everyone can agree on of what artificial intelligence actually is. Broadly, what we're talking about is using computers to find patterns hidden in large amounts of data, and then using those patterns to predict, to personalize, or to automate things. So I'll give you a simple example of something that isn't actually artificial intelligence, but it's kind of a precursor that's led up to it. You know, when you're on your smartphone and you're doing a text and the phone makes some suggestions of what word it thinks ought to come next. Well, that's a bit rubbish quite often because it's only looking back one or two words to predict the next word. So I might type in, I need to go, and it suggests home, or actually I want to type on holiday. So that's very simple and not artificial intelligence. Where artificial intelligence kicks things up to another level is that it looks at millions and millions of words that people have used in the past, and phrases, sentences, paragraphs, books even. And then it uses that to distinguish the patterns. And it also learns, so we can teach it as we go along, what our behaviours are, what our style of writing is, for example. And it gets better and better all the time at predicting what we might want next. An example of that from healthcare, there's lots of AI uses in healthcare. And artificial intelligence was used by a team over in Bath because they wanted to analyse the sound of a person moving around their home and see if they could predict when somebody might be becoming more vulnerable to a fall. So they used a simple smart device, an Alexa or Echo Dot, those types of very cheap devices in people's homes to listen to what was the normal pattern of a person moving around their home. And then they found that they could actually detect changes that indicated a person was more likely to have a fall. And of course, that meant they could trigger interventions, a person to go around and put in different grab rails, for example, or help the person do some exercises to make them less vulnerable. Parkinson's UK a couple of years ago did some work where they analysed the words that people were using in their online forums about Parkinson's. And they uncovered that the top concerns people had, such as keeping fit. And that prompted Parkinson's UK to make some YouTube sessions, which they hadn't done before, to help people, particularly in COVID times, to keep up their fitness levels. You see, examples like that raise questions. How much should Parkinson's UK tell people, using that forum, that their words are being analysed to potentially produce new services that the organisation might put on? So every time we use AI, we've always got to think, what are the consequences of this? What might happen that perhaps would be a desirable consequence or an undesirable consequence? Because there are so many different ways that AI can be used and so many consequences, lots of leaders tell me they want to sit back and wait so that others figure out the complicated stuff and they'll just come in and use AI later, which doesn't sound unreasonable. One chief executive of a financial services business described it to me. They want to be the second mouse. So the first mouse goes into the mouse trap and doesn't have a good result. Second mouse can go in and nibble the cheese because the trap's already been triggered. Again, sounds reasonable, but it's not an option for us in the modern world because artificial intelligence is coming into our organisations whether we know it or not. An example of that is from another client where they needed to put in a new telephone handling system. They're a regulated business, so they have to record phone calls. And the old system was great when everyone was working in the office, but now we have people working in a hybrid way. It wasn't so good at recording calls when people were working from home. So they went out, specified what they wanted for a new phone system, installed it, and it went live. A month after it went live, a supervisor got a warning flashed up on their computer screen saying that a call handler had been abusing a customer. And they thought, oh, that's not the sort of business we are. What on earth's gone on here? So the supervisor went over and had a word with the call handler and said, hey, what's this about this phone call with Mr. Smith? And the call handler said, oh, no, Mr. Smith, no, he's profoundly deaf. So I was raising my voice to be understood by him, and he was raising his voice because that's how he always speaks on the phone. Okay, no abuse of the customer, but hang on a minute. Why did the computer think there was abuse? Well, what they didn't know, nobody had told them through the process of procuring the new phone system, was that tucked inside it was a type of artificial intelligence called sentiment analysis. And that was analysing not only the words used in phone calls, but the tone of voice that was being used to predict where abuse of a customer might be happening. So I've lobbied the government to say it ought to be mandatory for companies supplying third-party services and products to specify where artificial intelligence is in the systems that they're supplying and what it does. That's not the law at the moment. So we are all gradually acquiring services in our organisations that have AI embedded in them, whether we know it or not. A couple of examples from everyday use. Google Maps, I use it all the time. That actually is using a lot of artificial intelligence to figure out the best route for us to go from one place to another, taking all the information it can gather about what's happening with traffic at the moment and what it knows about how quickly that traffic, for example, has cleared in the past. Email spam filters, great stuff. They are predicting which email coming into my inbox is potentially spam and which isn't. And when I move something out of the spam box, because I say, oh, no, that's not actually spam, that's something I genuinely want, it's learning. It's being intelligent, it's learning about what my parameters are for the next time. And a huge amount of artificial intelligence tools are being integrated into the whole Microsoft Office suite. So we're going to be coming across those more and more. Now, you've probably heard over the past year about generative AI. That's the type of artificial intelligence that ChatGPT uses, and it's been talked about hugely over the past year. Here's an example of generative AI in action. This little video that's playing now is using a tool called Synthesia to generate the video. And what you can do with Synthesia and many other tools is ask it from a very short prompt to write a script for a video that you want to create. It will then pick out appropriate images, video clips, and this avatar, this person talking here is not a person at all. It's an avatar who's never existed. Who can speak the script, and I can change the avatar, I can change the voice that it uses, the accent it uses, and so many different parameters to come up with something which is a good video that can be used for whatever purpose. Now, for us, we want to create this video about whether companies should ban their employees from using ChatGPT. The script that Synthesia originally came up with is nowhere near good enough for a professional audience. We decided to have humans write the script and then use the avatar as a way of communicating the script. We also believe in being really transparent. So the end of this video declares that the script was written by humans and the video made by using artificial intelligence, because we believe it's really important that people know where artificial intelligence is being used and they don't just come across it and wonder, is this real or is this artificial? Now, there's lots of myths about what artificial intelligence is and how it works. You may have heard that the Americans have crossed artificial intelligence with a chocolate digestive, and apparently it's one smart cookie. Ooh, horrible joke. It is my only artificial intelligence joke. AI isn't smart. It's not only not good at creating jokes, as that one's just shown, but it doesn't have common sense. So they haven't got our knowledge of the world, our understanding of the world. So they look at lots of information, lots of data, but AI just isn't smart. It can be creative, so creating videos. You may have tried a service called Midjourney that's amazing at creating art. Oops, sorry, I'm too far forward. But music, text, all sorts of things can be created by AI, but let's not mistake that for actually being smart. Second myth is lots of people think AI and robots are the same thing. Well, they can be, but very often they're not. So if you see a robot operating in a factory environment, most of them are just doing the same task repetitively, set up by computers, just traditional computer programming, no AI involved at all. And most artificial intelligence happens inside computers with no robotics attached to it. So quite often in the media, you'll see a picture when they're trying to illustrate AI of a robotic hand typing on a keyboard. That's rubbish. Robots don't need to type. The AI is in the machine, so we don't need to have AI and robots to make it work inside computers. So they can be the same thing, but very often AI and robots are different. And the third myth, rather, is that People often think AI can do absolutely anything, but it can't. Two reasons. One, if there's no pattern, remember at the beginning we said AI is all about finding patterns hidden in the data. If there is no pattern, if things are just random chance, then there's nothing there for AI to act on. It just becomes a random generator. But secondly, why AI can't do anything is because we, at the moment, only have what's called narrow artificial intelligence. So we set up artificial intelligence to do just one thing. So a self-driving car, for example, is using lots of different artificial intelligence algorithms all put together to figure out how to drive a car. But it can't then go off and write a poem. Even the cleverest generative AI that we have today, if it's set up to produce words, it's going to struggle to drive a car. So we set up these things to be narrow artificial intelligence. You may have seen a lot in the media, there was a lot at the end of last year about the potential for existential threat from AI. Is it going to wipe out humanity? Well, that's talking about a different type of AI that we don't actually have at the moment. That would be artificial general intelligence, which would be able not to be narrow, but to do absolutely anything. And that's why people worry about it. How would we control something that was so powerful that could do far more and far quickly than the human brain? So we don't have that artificial general intelligence at the moment, but we are still worrying about, does the type of AI we have today make us terrorists, for example, more able to make bioweapons? So there's lots of different views around that. My view is until we get quantum computing or some other very different way of processing data, we're not actually going to get into the realms where AI threatens humanity. However, that having been said, we do need regulations and controls for how we use AI today, as well as for the harms it might do in the future. But that's perhaps another topic. So looking at opportunities for charities and fundraising to use artificial intelligence, well, first of all, how ready are we to use it? This on the screen shows a survey that AI Governance did last year. We found that we asked leaders of organisations how ready they were to come up with ideas for using AI, how experienced they were. And what we found was that only 14% of charity and third sector boards had one member or more who had AI knowledge. And as you can see, I'm trying to highlight it on the screen there, charity and media didn't really come out well compared to other sectors in society for having boards that were really skilled in understanding what AI is and thinking about how to use it. Recently, the Charity Digital Skills Report found 78% of UK charities think AI is relevant to their charity and could transform it, but only 4% are actually developing services that use AI. So overall, what we can say is there's a real job to do to get board members skilled so they can see the opportunities to use AI and support you in your ideas to use it. I find a really effective way to help board members do that is to show them examples of what AI can do. So here's one example from the Surrey Wildlife Trust. I won't play the video, but I have put the link to it there, so do take a look at it. What they've done is they've used a People's Postcode Lottery grant, and they've taken data from satellites and used artificial intelligence to figure out where similar types of habitats are near to each other across Surrey, and they could be linked to improve biodiversity, to give wildlife corridors, for example, to move through an area rather than just being in isolated areas. And it's a really good example of taking data that's publicly available, that's satellite data, putting it together with their own data in the Wildlife Trust and their human knowledge to provide a prediction that they can then go out and act on. Turning to a more global scene, 50% of all droughts in the world happen in Africa. So AI has been used in lots of different ways to reduce that problem. One way it's being used is to give early warning of when droughts could happen, so food and essential supplies can be got on the ground early. And there are many different programs and schemes out there to detect pests and diseases in crops, so farmers can give the right treatment at the right time, they can lower costs, they can improve yields and need to use less water. And there's a global water project that's used hundreds of thousands of pieces of information to predict where water networks, pipelines in other words, could fail in 13 different African countries. They're then able to pass this information to the local network, water network operators, so that those operators can do preventative maintenance, stopping breakdowns. That's reduced costs and led to a much more reliable water supply. Back at home, we might use an AI in hyper-personalising our fundraising campaigns. This is an example from the business world. Harley-Davidson decided that they kind of had a gut feel that there was a difference between the people who spent a lot of money online with them and in their showrooms and the people who just spent a little bit. So they took lots of data from the past and analysed it to see if there was a pattern, and they found that there was. They then use this to predict when people are going onto the website for the first time or coming to showrooms, which people are going to become the high spenders of the future and which are not. And they, as this press cutting showed, they increased their sales leads by almost 3,000% doing that. So, it's a huge benefit to them. And you can see how in fundraising, you might be able to predict which people are going to be your large donors in the future if you have that data from the past to analyse. Immediately, I was thinking about this. You think, well, is that intrusive? We've had lessons in the past about targeting potential high net worth people for donations where things didn't go very well. So we've got to think about how we use these tools, again, with wisdom and integrity. Now, some work's been done using AI to cut out some of the friction in donations. There's a research project that targeted radio adverts on smart speakers and other devices for the NSPCC, WWF and Comic Relief. And what they had was people listening on their Alexa or other smart device. And the advert gave the listeners the option to find out more about the individual charity or donate straight away. All they had to do was give a simple verbal instruction to the smart device to get the extra information or make the donation. Now, many things that happen in the charity sector can happen in business too. So this is a list of opportunities to use artificial intelligence. And there's so many different ways that we can use it internally in our organisations. I expect most of you don't have the funding to have a personal assistant. No, I don't. AI can be your personal assistant. So it can do things like note-taking and recording a virtual meeting, producing action lists and prompts so that people with the actions against their name are prompted to do things. Summarising meetings is a really straightforward AI application that's built into lots of tools like Zoom and Teams. If you've got a long PDF document and not enough time to read it, generative AI can summarise it for you. There's a tool called chatpdf.com that's really great at just summarising your PDF documents. If you want ideas for events, ChatGPT, Bard from Google, Microsoft's Bing, these are all tools that you can use to generate ideas in ways that we haven't been able to do before. Or it can come up with ideas for how you might write your campaigns to appeal more to different audiences. I mentioned generative AI a couple of times there. Just always beware of two things. First of all, if you're uploading a PDF to chatpdf.com for it to summarise it for you, great in theory, but is there sensitive information in that document? Because as soon as you're releasing these into these openly available tools, you don't know what it's going to do with the information that you put in there. So never upload anything, never share anything that has anything that's sensitive in it. And the second caveat is that generative AI is making things up. I can't stress this enough. Lots of people say to me, oh, but it's finding information from somewhere on the internet, isn't it? No, sometimes, but not necessarily. What it's doing, just like that predictive text on your smartphone, is just predicting which words should come together after the prompts you put in. So if I put into ChatGPT a prompt that says, imagine you're fundraising for a Bristol charity, come up with 3 event ideas that have never been tried in Bristol before. It'll come up with the 3 event ideas and they might look very reasonable, but they might have been done before. They might actually be things that are completely ridiculous and just wouldn't work in Bristol. ChatGPT hasn't got that common sense to know what's possible and what isn't. And it certainly would not be able to check back and see, have these things actually been done in Bristol before? So we always need to check that the things that it says are true are actually true. Quite often they're not, they're made up. Other things that you might use AI for, storytelling. There's a tool called Pictory.ai. And you can get a free trial of it. You can use that to write a script and turn that script into a video or a presentation in minutes, all with images that are chosen to support your message. So storytelling, we know in fundraising, is so incredibly important. Tools like this can condense the process and make it incredibly efficient for us. An idea we might think about and get inspired from the business world is a US fashion retailer who's really quite old-fashioned. And what they did was they send out catalogues to the clothes that are available that season to people, and people select from the catalogue and place their order online or by phone. So it's quite an old-fashioned way of working. They actually spent over $200 million a year on this catalogue marketing, so huge amounts of money, not to mention all the paper and ink wasted in doing it, because most of them ended up in the bin or the recycling. So what this fashion retailer did was they said, I wonder if there's a pattern in the people who actually go ahead to make a purchase when they've received a catalogue and the people who don't. Because if we can find a pattern, then we'll just send the catalogue to the people who are likely to buy something, and not send it to the others. They analysed the data and found, yep, there was a pattern. So then they started sending the catalogue to those who were likely to buy, and not those who weren't, cutting their waste and increasing their profitability by 5%. So I'm guessing you can probably think straight away of ways that you might be able to analyse data in your organisation to think about how you can do things that cut waste and perhaps increase donations as well. I'll mention chatbots. Love them or hate them, chatbots driven by artificial intelligence can be brilliant at fielding, for example, initial inquiries from potential donors. They could gather information and they can direct the inquiry to the appropriate person within the organisation. So they can cut out a lot of human interaction. Maybe that's not a good thing, maybe it is, we can discuss that later. But I've come across one company, a regulated business, that's actually using artificial intelligence in that front line of dealing with its customers to identify who the vulnerable customers are. And what it's doing then is filtering their calls through to a customer service team who've got no time pressures on them, and they can spend whatever time's needed to support the customer. Customers feel listened to and dissatisfactions in that organisation are going down. So again, maybe we can think of ways to use chatbots that actually help our beneficiaries by filtering them and supporting them in ways that are quite subtly different from each other. There's a tool called BotPress, BOTPRESS. That can be used to create chatbots that use ChatGPT, and they integrate with CRM, customer relationship management systems like HubSpot. So if you're already using HubSpot, you might want to look at something like BotPress. When you're setting up a marketing campaign, you can go far beyond the old style of working where we just sent out the same thing to donors, first email, second email, third email. We can really tailor those interactions that supporters get, which medium we use to communicate with them, the tone of voice, the style and content, really personalising it to the individual. Donor retention, of course, is a huge area in fundraising. If you've got enough data, is there a pattern behind donors staying with you and donors ceasing making donations? Perhaps there is. Can you use that to predict donor behaviour? Can you change what you do to target your retention efforts to stop people who are most likely to leave? Possibly you can if you've got enough data. But do donors want you to be doing this? Do donors and beneficiaries want to interact with a chatbot rather than being able to speak to people? Maybe they do, maybe they don't. It's got to be thought through. Which takes us neatly on to looking at some of the threats and burdens and pitfalls of using AI. There are a huge amount of examples now of mistakes that have been made when using artificial intelligence. I'm just going to pick out a few examples here. In the US, a healthcare algorithm was used to assign risk scores, which would help hospitals and help insurance companies identify which patients were going to benefit from being directed into a special program for those at highest risk. So quite a sensible thing to do. But in order to figure out who was at highest risk, the algorithm's designers used the healthcare spending as a proxy for medical needs. And it was assumed that the higher costs for the medical treatment the person was going to get, that was going to be indicating greater need. But what actually they hadn't thought through was that Black people were more likely to be poorer and spend less on healthcare. So their needs would be just as high, but because the spending wasn't as high, they didn't get the attention they deserved. They didn't get put through to this special program. In 2019, Apple launched a credit card. It was quickly found to offer women significantly less credit than men. When pressed, why is this happening? Apple said, we don't know. We don't know enough about the data, sorry. They then turned to Goldman Sachs, who are the issuing bank for the Apple card, to explain it. And Goldman Sachs said, well, our algorithm isn't using gender as an input. So you imagine sort of columns and rows in a spreadsheet. It basically said, we haven't got a column for gender, so how can we possibly be discriminating? Because we haven't told customers which are men, we haven't told the algorithm which customers are men and which are women. This shows a real fundamental misunderstanding about data on behalf of Goldman Sachs, because there are many, many proxies in data for things like gender, ethnicity, age, all sorts of things we can have proxies in the data for. So just because you haven't got a column that says gender, age, ethnicity, doesn't mean there's not going to be any bias. In fact, by not having those columns, it makes it harder to look for bias. So having the information in a format that is actually combined with good data governance is essential. And both Apple and Goldman Sachs failed on that. The third example there is from IBM. They, for a while, were getting quite heavily into facial recognition technology for things like policing applications. But independent researchers found racial bias in many of these systems. And you think, well, that's a story from a little while ago, from 2020. That's all gone away now. It hasn't. There was a study that came out just at the end of last year which showed facial recognition systems are quite often biased against disabled people. And this was a particular example where they're looking at people with Down syndrome. So big companies are making mistakes all the time with using these tools. But I'll give you one positive example. On the other hand, Xerox, they were looking at how they could stop their attrition rate being so bad. So one site in America, people would come for 6 months, and then too often people were leaving within 6 or 9 months. So they analysed the data, and they found that people who lived further away from the site were more likely to leave within that 6 or 9 month period. So somebody said, okay, when we're looking at who to hire, that first stage of interviewing people, we'll screen out people who live further away, and we'll focus on people who live nearer so that they don't leave so often. Great in theory, but a wise person in Xerox said, hang on a minute, our site here is in quite an affluent area. If we screen out people who live further away, that's tending to screen out the people who live in less affluent areas. We want them to come and work here. We want them to have the opportunity to increase their wealth in their family, to have the opportunities to develop new skills. So we actually want them in the data and in the application process. We don't want to screen them out. So that's a really good example of a company thinking about what they could do with data, recognizing it's at odds with their values, and then not doing something that they might otherwise have chosen to do. So there are masses of other threats that we look at when I'm working with businesses, of issues and dangers of using AI. So, for example, failing to understand the result AI gives is based on predictions and not absolute certainty. I mentioned this earlier on. If you're using generative AI like ChatGPT, it's guessing at what words come together. It's not surfacing truth. And this has tripped people up. 2 lawyers in the United States were actually fined last year because they used ChatGPT in a lawsuit to come up with names of cases, references that they referred to in a submission to the judge. These 2 cases were fiction. It's obvious that the lawyers should have checked, is this a real case? Did it really say what ChatGPT says it said? And they found out it wasn't true, but that's not what they did. So, even people who ought to know better trip themselves up all the time. At the presentation that I gave at the Chartered Accountants in Bristol last year, where Sophie was, you may remember I asked Bing Search to research how accountants' views of the impact of their artificial intelligence have changed over the past 5 years. And not surprisingly, it came out with a chart which showed rising concerns over a period of years. And it all sounded really reasonable. It was what I was expecting to see. But I did check to see, was this generative AI results, were they real? Have the research actually taken place? And when I clicked through on the links, I found, no, that wasn't what the research actually said at all. They'd basically given me what information they thought I would want, but actually it wasn't real. So we all suffer from cognitive bias. There are 188 different cognitive biases, including confirmation bias. And that's the one that leads us to want to believe things that fit our worldview as we already have it. So again, can't stress it enough. We need to be skeptical and check the information that generative AI tools give us. Here's another example of a threat that we come across. AI has been used quite a lot in cancer detection, and sometimes with great success. There was a case a couple of years ago where a group created a model to detect a certain type of cancer, and it seemed to be absolutely brilliant when they were setting it up and testing it. Then they started feeding it in new images, which it hadn't seen before, and to try and predict were they cancer or not cancer. And the model was rubbish, absolutely awful at making predictions. And someone thought, how can it be so good in testing and yet so awful when we start giving it new information to look at? Somebody spotted the new images didn't have little rulers in them to gauge the size of the cancer. Whereas in the training images, when the scan showed cancer, the image had a ruler in it, but no ruler where there was no cancer. So basically what the model builders had done had created a system which was brilliant at detecting whether there was a ruler in the image or not. So sometimes when we test things, we find that we're actually doing something very different from what we originally intended. And the third bullet point on the slide there talks about not actually solving business problems. And this is a real one to focus on in your organisations. Are we actually solving something that is an issue for our organisation or not? An example of that is a financial services business I've done some work with, where they tried using artificial intelligence in recruiting people. And they set it up to look for certain behaviours. So people would do a first interview using an online system like this video interview system. And the AI was pretty good at detecting certain behaviours, but The project was declared a failure after a year and stopped because the company said it doesn't actually help us solve our problem. Why not? Well, first of all, because this company recruits for skills, not behaviours. So when the hiring managers were looking at the recommendations the algorithm had given them, they pretty much ignored them because the algorithm was saying, interview the following people, they've got the behaviours you're looking for. The hiring managers were looking at the CVs and going, but they haven't got the skills I'm looking for. Why would I hire them? Why would I even interview them? So that was a failure. The second failure was because 60% of the candidates decided not to complete the online AI-powered assessment. They didn't have to, it was voluntary, but it just shows that people can be quite resistant to these tools. So if we're using tools in a certain way where we want people to interact with them, whether that's staff internally, donors, beneficiaries, people don't want to interact with them, that's going to be a fail. Just looking at time, I will skip through things, but I will just mention environmental impact. Training lots of these AI models processes a huge amount of data. That takes energy, and it takes a lot of water to cool the data centers where this processing happens. So if you've got values in your organization and mission to reduce your environmental impact, you've got to think really carefully about whether using AI fits with those goals or not. I will just skip ahead on a couple of things rather than going through all these. I'll stop screen sharing at that point. So just wanted to touch on what we might do in our own organisations to try and mitigate some of the risks that were on the screen there and some I've mentioned. First of all, training and skills. It's really clear that we need to help people understand what these tools are and what the issues are. And secondly, we need to have really clear ethics and governance. It's a whole topic in itself, but the mantra, just because we can doesn't mean we should, really needs to be in our minds all the time we're thinking about using AI. So for example, we could replace some jobs in our organisations with technology. But is that right for our charity, our donors, our beneficiaries? We could use data to understand which donors are most likely to stop giving. But at what point are we using too much data? You know, if we started absorbing data from donors' social media posts, are we invading their privacy? Perhaps we are. So just to wind up then, to weigh up the benefits and burdens, we've looked at what artificial intelligence is, talked about opportunities to use it, we talk about the threats that can bring. But is it actually on balance a plus or a minus? Well, declaring an interest, I'm obviously an advocate for AI, so you're going to expect me to come down on the plus side, and I will. AI, I definitely believe, will enhance our skills, so we need to learn to use it. The skills that are going to be in demand in the future are things like being confident with data. So if you're at the moment okay with a spreadsheet, but you've never really used Power BI, for example, move yourself up that ranking so you can use more advanced business insight tools. Do we understand where data comes from, what the prediction that artificial intelligence really means and why it might be wrong? So those kind of analytical skills can be really important in the future. It's definitely going to be great for cutting out time-consuming and repetitive tasks like data entry. So you still have people in your organisation that sit there typing in information about who attended which event. We can automate that and so many other things. We need data to be clean and well-maintained to build fundraising campaigns on top of. So it's an advantage if we can automate that process. And it's going to help us generate ideas for events, for marketing, and free up times for humans to do the things that we do best, like donor relationship building and personalising supporters and coaches. Sorry about that. On the negative side, charities that create admin jobs, for example, for low-skilled people, are going to have to choose between keeping those jobs for the social good they achieve or replacing them with automation. Needs of beneficiaries might grow if there's an increase in disadvantaged people who can't be part of this wonderful new world. So we really need to think about how we shift power to help disadvantaged people be part of it rather than be disadvantaged. And there's also a competition threat. Just Giving, I notice now, offer people AI-powered tools to help improve their storytelling. So the widespread availability of tools like that and many others mean that the competition for the donor pound is definitely going to grow. More people and charities using clever fundraising techniques as they become more affordable. So I believe we've all got a role to make sure that these tools are used with wisdom and integrity so they benefit society. There's pretty much no regulation at the moment outside things like GDPR to push people in the right direction. And I think businesses trying to make profits could mean we have quite a rocky time when society as a whole is worse off because of some of the changes AI is going to bring. So the Industrial Revolution took people away from the land. It's given people new opportunities in towns and cities. Sometimes those were unpleasant and dangerous, though, before eventually regulation turned them into things that were better for many. And I think it's the same with AI. We'll turn it to our advantage, but we need to make sure AI benefits 8 billion people, not just 8 billionaires. So 3 top tips for you: develop your data skills and those of your board members. There's a new metric for success at work. That's people who are good at handling and interpreting data. So forget any hang-ups you might have about maths at school. This is different. Be willing, secondly, to try out AI tools. So if you've got things like Salesforce, for example, there's a lot of AI tools built into that. So try them, experiment, see what happens. If your culture is risk averse and doesn't encourage experimentation, then think about who you need to influence in the organization to change that, so that experimentation is not just allowed, but considered a good thing. And then thirdly, consider the risks, the impacts, and AI ethics right from the start. So I hope that's a useful gallop through AI pros and cons. On balance, as you can tell, I'm pro AI when it's used with wisdom and integrity, and I really do believe it'll benefit all of you. So really happy to take your questions.
Thank you so much, Sue. Hearing you speak again after, as you mentioned, an accountant's, a corporate event I was lucky enough to come to last year. It was just so interesting with you using lots of different charity-based examples. I've got hundreds of questions. I'm sure lots of other people do. But first of all, there's a question that's in the chat. So over to Audrey. This has been so thought-provoking. Thank you. How would you suggest a charity get started on internal communications and board discussions?
Right, okay. Cool, that's an interesting one. So are you thinking there of how things are noted, or are you thinking there about how to get communications to a new level of creativity? Is it admin or is it creative? Do you mind switching on your microphone and tell me a bit more?
Yeah, thank you. It's possibly just a little bit more on the 3 points that you just said at the end, because I typed that question in and then you said, right, here's your 3 action points. And I was like, oh, that's what we need to do. So yeah, could you just expand a little bit on those 3?
Right, yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
I was talking about data skills, first of all. So when I sit in boardrooms, quite often everybody around the table will say, I think this and I feel that, and nobody's actually referring to the data. And actually marketing people quite often are really good at referring to data because they're used to dealing with statistics more than many others around the table. But it's about saying, well, what have we actually got in the way of information? What does that tell us that we ought to be able to rely on? Because sometimes things are counterintuitive. So getting people better at having those conversations and saying, well, what do the data tell us about this? Trying out AI tools. I mentioned culture. I think this is really interesting one to look at in the charity sector, because we don't want to waste a single penny of donors' money, quite rightly. But is it waste if we try out something and it doesn't work? So I gave you the example of that business where they tried interviewing, looking for behaviours, and after a year said, oh, it's rubbish, it doesn't work because we actually want to recruit for skills. So for them, they could say, excuse me, that was a failure. But on the other hand, they learned a lot of lessons from it. They learned more about how to specify their future AI projects. They learned that their hiring managers will just stick to their existing way of working rather than switching over to something else. So I think we do need to have culture in our organisations that says it's okay to experiment. And that's perhaps a conversation where the board really need to be engaged, asking the board, how much could we spend in the next year on trying out AI tools, on testing things that might actually not produce any benefit for us. 85% of data science projects fail to produce any tangible result for an organisation. Kind of huge. So you're going into lots of these projects thinking it's probably not going to be useful in the direct way, the first way we're hoping for, but we'll learn other things for it. And then the final thing I talked about was considering risks and impacts and ethics. So again, quite often your board will say, oh, well, there's a risk of donors not liking something, so we won't do it, or there's a risk that we might make a mistake in some other way. If you've got a good risk register, you should be able to put things on the risk register and then say, okay, here's the risk. Here's how we're going to mitigate it, so it's now less of a risk, or we've managed to make it completely go away. So in the first case about, and tying into the second point about experimenting, I would say that the board need to think things through and say, can we change our culture to allow some experimentation? Can we, for example, if we're thinking about using AI in some of our donor relations activities, test it, produce an A and a B test so we can test out and get some real results that tell us what our donors actually think, rather than just guessing at what we think they might think. Does that help?
Yeah, thank you. No, that's really helpful because it's such a massive subject. It's really just thinking about what are the steps that you could start to take.
Yeah,
it's been really interesting.
The other thing I always recommend people to start with was 2 things. Is depending on what your data is like in the organisation, you can either start by saying, what data have we got that we might be able to use to predict to personalize or to automate something. That's one way of looking at it. What data have we got? The other way organizations sort of often started to say, what are our real business problems? What are the things holding us back as an organization at the moment that we would dearly love to solve? And think about one or two of those and see, have we got the data to do something that might, again, predict, personalize or automate? So is it the data or is it the problem solving that you need to brainstorm first?
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Next question in the chat, Sue, and something I wanted to ask as well. Where can we get some training for those that have no experience at all with AI and data interpretation? So do you have any recommendations for kind of entry-level courses that might be useful?
Yeah. So 3 things I think I'll give. One is an organisation, charity called Khan Academy, Khan, Khan Academy, and that was set up by an American guy, Mr. Khan, and he was starting off by being asked to tutor some of his nieces and nephews in maths because he was particularly good at maths. So he started doing this, and then more of their friends wanted this tutoring and more people wanted it. So he set up this charity to provide free online modules. You just take a little bite-sized chunk of anything to do with maths. So if you're sort of thinking, I just don't understand statistics, look at Khan Academy on the statistics modules, and they're so well explained. You don't have to be any maths genius at all to be able to get them. It's school level explanations of things, but done really, really cleverly. So I recommend that to just boost your confidence that, yeah, I can understand this. And I always think about statistics as more being about words than numbers. It's how we're actually putting words around the numbers, because I'm more of a word person than a number person. So, we have to get over some of our hang-ups about numbers. So Khan Academy first. Secondly, I'd say look on Microsoft. They have a tool called Power BI, and there's lots and lots of free training about how to use Power BI within the Microsoft environment. Now, clearly, they're trying to get you to use it and sign up and pay money over eventually for processing and so on. But you don't have to do any payment in order to get the training. And then tied in with that, you might want to look at some of the other sites where you do pay a little bit for the training, places like Udemy, Udemy. Udemy do a lot of courses which are pretty cheap, sort of £10, £30 to do a basic course in anything to do with data science, technology, AI. There's a huge amount of courses on there. They are quite variable quality. So whereas the Microsoft ones are all pretty good quality, the Udemy ones, they're a bit variable. So you want to look at the reviews to see how well something's actually been received by other people before you decide to spend your hard-earned cash. But those are the 3 I'd suggest, which can help you over time up your levels of confidence and skill.
Brilliant. Thank you, Sue. I've certainly taken the takeaway. We use Power BI. Didn't realise that there could be so much more that I could find out by looking on the, what training they offer. So I'm going to take that away and follow up. Several lovely comments in the chat, which just thanking you, and one lovely comment from Jenny just saying thank you, this has been the most interesting and one of the most balanced introductions to AI that they have heard. Question from Ruth, and sorry, just to say, if anybody wants to ask anything in person, please just raise your hand as well and we'll come to you as well. Question from Ruth saying thanks, this has been great. Any more specific advice on using AI with sensitive data? As a freelancer, she cannot risk sharing anything sensitive from clients, and also sometimes get struggle for client permission for using AI for notes and notes from meetings and things like that.
Yeah, it's a really, really good point. I mean, because I've got clients in all sorts of different environments, so they'll quite often give me a sort of temporary login to part of their system, and I have to recognise that that's got to be ring-fenced within that piece of work, and I can't let anything escape from there to anywhere else in the environment that I'm dealing with. So I think it's a real problem, and we haven't cracked it yet for how to use this data in ways that respect some of these boundaries. I guess I always have in my mind the GDPR regulations and treat that as my gold standard for thinking about who gave consent for what if I'm dealing with personal data. And then if it's not personal data, perhaps it's sensitive financial data from an organisation. Again, I'm trying to apply those same things and say, well, what's the harm that might happen if I use this data outside of a particular environment? So I guess the answer, Ruth, is probably if your clients are using AI in a way that they're happy in their own environment and you can keep it in that environment, that works. But yes, if you're using your own tools for multiple different clients, that could be really difficult. And I don't know an answer to that. I'll think about it, but I haven't got an answer. Oh, you're on mute, Sophie.
Sorry, I clicked and then moved away too quickly. Thank you. Claire has a follow-on question, just saying, if you use AI, does that mean it grabs all the info that you provide? Is there an option for you to keep it confidential?
Yeah. So we're talking particularly here about generative AI tools. So these are the ones like ChatGPT and Midjourney and so on that create these new types of responses for you. If you're just using the bog standard one that's available on a website, so for ChatGPT, it's chat.open.ai, then yes, as soon as you put something in there, your prompt as it's called, that is going out into the wild and you no longer have any control of it. You can create your own ChatGPT and have that just within your own organization. So that's what more and more organizations are doing, so that it is then confidential. It does need a little bit of technical knowledge to do it, but it's getting easier all the time.
Great. A question from Zainab. A couple of questions. First one, how would you recommend the utilization of AI tools in prospect research and development, particularly for data analysis, prospect identification and cultivation?
Yeah, I think where I would start, Zainab, is by saying, okay, let's have a discussion with the board about what do we actually want to do, because we could take our data from the past and think about who might be our high spending donors in the future. But do we actually want to do that? And how much information from across the organisation, from outside the organisation, do we want to take in? And I gave the example there about potentially using people's social media feeds. We could do that. We know a lot about our donors. If they're on social media, we could be using information they're putting there to be able to tell how their interests are changing over time. And there's a type of AI called entity recognition, where you would look perhaps for certain words, which might be charities or might be types of interest that the person has, philanthropic interest, for example. And you could see how that was changing over time from some of their social media posts. But is that ethically the right thing to do? It's going to vary. The only thing about ethics is it's grey areas. There are no particular rules. And the metric I always use with organisations is to say, if this was on the front page of the newspaper, how proud would we feel about what we've done? If we wouldn't feel proud about doing it, then let's not do it in the first place. So I guess that's the first thing, thinking about what you actually feel comfortable doing as an organisation. And then the second point, to answer your first question, Zainab, is how much data have you actually got? Because AI is about using large amounts of data to find those patterns. If you've actually only got, say 100 rows, if you think about it in spreadsheet terms, it's not always in a spreadsheet, but if you think about it, say 100 rows and 10 columns, probably not enough data to be able to find any sort of meaningful pattern. So do you need more rows, more columns in order to find some sort of meaningful pattern? If not, with your lesser amount of data, just straightforward data analysis can be really helpful. So we don't always have to use artificial intelligence. Quite often all we actually need to do is analyze the data and find that people who do X also do Y, just a simple correlation between two factors. So that's more data analysis than AI. And I spot the second question there. In the absence of laws and regulations, any suggested resources for developing policies? I have seen a policy. Where did I see a policy? I can't remember. It was the NCVO website, I think it might have been. I have seen somewhere, I think it was NCVO, where there was a policy about generally using AI in the third sector. And I haven't seen anything particularly about AI in higher education institutions, except there was one. There's a whole set of things the government put out in the last year or two about AI in procurement in the public sector. So you might want to look for that and glean some information from that. That could be handy. But in most of these areas, we're really starting from a blank sheet of paper. So it's about perhaps we get together some other higher education organisations and say, hey, can we get together and collaborate to come up with a framework, a template for policy on using AI in the organisation, and then we'll adapt that and to our own specific needs and specific environments.
Thank you, Sue. There's one more question in the chat. I think this is from Habon. If organisations are already struggling to remove biases and address discrimination, how do we ensure to decrease bias in AI? Does it hinge on the right people inputting into AI to ensure output has minimal risks? Is this a particular risk for organisations with minimal diversity?
Yeah, great question. So I love where you've started from there, Habon. You've not sort of said we need to get rid of bias, and you're absolutely right there. We can decrease it, but we're not going to suddenly get rid of it because it's in our environment, it's in our data, it's baked in. So it's about how we recognise where it is and what harms that might do, and how do we counter it. And you're also spot on in what you're alluding to, I think, in the last part of that question. When organisations have teams that come from different life experiences. They are the great people to be thinking about AI use and saying, but hang on a minute, for people I know, this use wouldn't be particularly good, or in these circumstances, we might have an issue. So it is about having cross-functional teams of people who've got different life experiences, different stakeholders from outside the organisation as well as inside, all coming together from the very earliest stages of you thinking about how you're going to use AI to say, what might the negatives be? What could the implications be? And how will we mitigate that? How will we reduce the bias? Because it is just baked into so many of our data sets and so many of the tools that we use. It's about recognising it and trying to mitigate it as far as we can.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sue. We are literally approaching 11 o'clock. I don't think there's anybody else that would like to ask a question in person. The thank yous will now start to come in on the chat for you. Massively appreciate you coming today and taking time to speak to us all. Can I just remind everybody that we are sending out feedback forms. There's a chance for you to make any comments on the session. If anybody wants to write anything for Sue, I will make sure that that is passed back to her, because I'm sure that's really useful for her data as well on these kind of sessions. So massive thank you again. Thank you for everyone for joining, and see you next time.